Okay, we're at the top of the hour and I think we'll get ourselves kicked off. So hello everyone and welcome to Tech Canada's Deeper Insights webinar series. I'm Mark Johnson, Director of Sales and Marketing for Tech Canada, and I'm very happy to host this latest installment of our series. You know, our webinars are designed to highlight timely topics and equip business leaders with the latest insights to strategically approach the complex issues and business uncertainty that surrounds us. Today, we're looking at a challenge that may be lessening in its impact a little bit since its peak post-pandemic, but will always be top of mind for most business owners and CEOs, supply chain management. We're joined by Professor Schulich Rungtusanatham of the Schulich School of Business at York University, who will provide strategic tips on how to effectively manage supply chains, particularly in a Canadian context. Now, Johnny is a Canadian Research Chair in Supply Chain Management at York. He's a 2017 fellow inductee of the Decision Sciences Institute and an award-winning researcher and educator. He's considered one of the top 50 authors of operations management and supply chain management research and one of the top contributors to the field of operations management. His research related to quality management, mass customization, and supply chain disruptions have appeared in top academic journals, academic and business journals, I should say, across the country and North America. His current research focuses on the attributes, triggering events, performance consequences, and mitigation of supply disruptions. Clearly an expert in his field, Johnny will help you ask the right questions when it comes to your overall supply chain management and production process. What initiatives should you consider? What shouldn't you do? Johnny will also offer his insights into why he believes effective supply chain management still has a long road ahead within Canada, while offering things organizations should do right away to mitigate the challenges they face. A reminder too that as we progress through today's webinar, please enter any questions you might have in the chat feature on LinkedIn or on Zoom, and we'll be sure to bring them up with Johnny as we go through the morning session. This session will also be recorded for future viewing and available on our YouTube channel before the end of the week. So without further ado, it's my sincere pleasure for you to join me in welcoming Professor Schulich Rungtusanatham to today's Deeper Insights webinar series. Johnny, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark. Hello from Ontario. It is indeed a pleasure and honor to spend time with all of you today and talk about management of supply chains. Here's a brief agenda with that wonderful introduction that Mark gave. I'm going to skip a lot of who am I and go into talking about what is the supply chain that we actually manage? How do we actually know if we're actually doing a good job managing supply chains effectively? What tips can I give you as you think about improving your management supply chains and by highlighting the key takeaways? So as Mark mentioned, this is who I am. I'm fortunate to actually be a Canada Research Chair in Supply Chain Management, which basically means that the federal government is actually paying a large chunk of my salary. I'm Thai by birth, hence the Rungtusanatham last name, Chinese by ethnicity, US citizen, spent 30 years in the US, and very recently in 2019, joined Canada and live and now work in Canada. Mark has already talked about my expertise, so I'm not going to belabor that point. Mark has already mentioned that I am indeed fortunate to have received a number of recognitions, including being a fellow of this institute called the Decision Science Institute and being recognized as a global researcher, top researcher in operations and supply chain management globally. What's probably not evident is the fact that my research is problem-driven, practice-driven. In my career, I've actually had the fortune to work with a number of Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies, including very recently Loblaw, and have in the past worked with Deere and Chevron, and with Supply Chain Canada, which is the association that is hopefully going to emerge as the de facto professional home for anybody working in supply chain management. So let's get into what is this supply chain. First and foremost, let me begin by saying it's a mischaracterization because this is a typical picture of what a supply chain is. If you are Z, the company, you are actually connected to many, many other entities. We call them nodes, the blue oval dots, that actually are connected to one another through these arrows. Right? So typically we refer to everything that comes into your Z as physical supply and everything that you send down the supply chain until it reaches the hands of the consumer as physical distribution. Not only are you managing physical flow of goods and services, but you often are required to manage information that flows from upstream to downstream, as well as downstream upstream. Now, 4 key attributes I'd like to highlight about the supply chain that you manage. First, it's really not a chain. It's not one chain, but it's actually many, many networks. 2, your supply chain is not a static entity in the sense that once you draw it, if you can draw it completely, it stays the same always. It's actually like a living organism because it evolves over time. And the reason why it evolves is because decisions that you make, decisions that are taken by others, your suppliers, your customers, the government, actually change this picture. 3, decisions that you make to manage your supply chain will require trade-offs. And we'll talk a bit more about what these trade-offs are later on in the segment. And these trade-offs actually mean that you're not going to be able to manage your supply chains perfectly. So forget about being perfect. Think more about how do you actually minimize the consequences of bad decisions. Last but not least, as we all have seen what happened during COVID, in the early days of COVID, supply chain disruptions are inevitable. So when we talk about effective supply chain management, in another way of explaining effective supply chain management is, how do I reduce being disrupted? So what do we mean by managing supply chains effectively? Right? Let me start with an answer given by an old IBM commercial.
Where are my socks? If I don't get those socks, I'm out of business.
Did you check all your stocks?
There's no socks in my stocks.
Check down by the docks.
I'm the box. It's no socks.
I've checked every box. There's no box full of socks.
Forget about socks. I just saw hawks.
We got locks. We got frocks.
Not frocks, not walks, not locks, just socks.
You've got your clocks.
Supply chain problems? IBM has internet solutions.
Sure, blame the Scots.
This was a very cute commercial in the 80s, even before supply chain became a household name, even before we talked about supply chain management. Here's a situation of a business owner who sells stocks, the retail store, trying to figure out where her socks are. And she's talking to a Scotsman, she's talking to the people working at the docks, trying to find out where exactly are her socks, and then she gets delivered a box of clocks. It's a very interesting play on the OCK part of the words, right? So when you talk about managing supply chains effectively, what you're managing is avoiding this particular situation where you wanted socks, but you got clocks. For those of you who want to get access to the video, you can see there is a URL at the bottom that actually has a closed caption version, and feel free to email me if you want to get access to that. Now, I'm going to give you a simple goal when you think about managing supply chains effectively. And this goal is what I call right 6, okay? Because it says, if you're managing your supply chains correctly, effectively, and there is demand for the product, there's demand for your service. In other words, I'm not going to argue about whether you have the right product or the right service, or whether your product actually is something that customers want. Assume that is the case. Your product or service has a market. Managing supply chains effectively means that you are able to get your product or service to the right customer in the right quantity with the right quality asked for by the customer at the right time, not too early, not too late, in the right location, right place, and at the right cost, or if you're marketing, at the right price. Anytime that you're not able to satisfy one of these 6 rights can be an indication that you're not effective. And of course, the more rights that you're not able to achieve, the less effective you are. So when you talk about managing supply chains effective, I've alluded to this earlier, it's really about minimizing experiences of being disrupted, where clocks are being sent to you instead of socks, where you don't know where the socks are coming from, or where socks are stuck as it moves from some upstream supplier to you eventually. And you're minimizing, from a resilience perspective, time to recover when in fact you're disrupted. When your socks are being delivered at the wrong time to recover means that there's a way for you to expedite that shipment so that you can satisfy your customers. So let's talk about these tips, okay? I have 5 tips. Each tip actually has some implications, but these tips should provide you with enough of a starting point to ask good questions about your management or your organization's management of supply chains. The first tip goes back to Right 6. Use Right 6 as the North Star and actually check your decisions against this goal to avoid surprises. And this is what I mean by when I say that supply chain decisions are going to require trade-offs. If you make a decision to source from a supplier that actually has higher quality, then you may expect to actually pay a higher price for what you buy. If you decide to actually open up another location where your customers can pick up their goods, you're going to increase your cost, but at the same time, you may be able to provide better service. So as you think about the strategics and investments that you make for your organization, understand that it is probably a good practice for you to always ask this question: how is this decision, how is this initiative going to actually make sure that the right quantity is actually being produced and delivered? How is it going to make sure that we actually get the right customers? How is it going to actually make sure that we don't fail to deliver good quality products? How do we make sure that the customers actually are going to get it exactly, ideally exactly when he or she asks for the product, and so forth. So use Right 6 as the North Star for you to assess the decisions that you make with an understanding that there's not going to be a perfect decision or perfect action that's going to satisfy all 6 rights. Tip number 2. In 2018, Deloitte surveyed procurement leaders globally from 39 countries and reported that 65% of them only have visibility of tier 1 suppliers. In other words, if you're one of those 500 procurement leaders, you only know who your tier 1 suppliers are. You do not know who their suppliers are. And this is part of the reason why we had the Mattel toy recall, because Mattel thought that its tier 1 supplier would be using a verified lead paint supplier that's tier 2. Instead, the tier 1 supplier did not. Well, Mattel only had visibility of the tier 1. It did not see what was happening with tier 1 as the tier 1 supplier working with its tier 2. Supply chains today actually are very complex. They involve global activities, global complex activities that are being performed around the world with multiple handoffs and trade-offs. They're long, very limited visibility. So magnifying visibility in the supply chain means essentially trying to figure out how your goods flow from as far up the supply chain as possible until it reaches you, because you cannot manage well what you do not see. I'm going to emphasize this point. You cannot manage well what you do not see. So one of the implications in a Canadian context is to understand, if you source globally, where your goods actually enter or exit Canada. If you source globally, where does it enter? If you sell globally, where does it exit? So Canada, and this is a high-level depiction of the various corridors of goods flowing in and out of Canada. In terms of seaports, there are 5 major seaports. The 5 largest ones are Vancouver, Montreal, Prince Rupert, Halifax, and St. John's. Let's talk about Vancouver. Well, Vancouver is the largest port for Canada, seaport. It's also the 3rd largest in North America in terms of tonnage, but it's also the 3rd from bottom in terms of how well it performs. So if everything that you buy flows through Vancouver, if everything that you sell flows out through Vancouver, then expect inefficiencies, delays, congestions, bottlenecks, okay? Bottlenecks. So you do not want to have a situation where eventually the port of Vancouver is shut off from the rest of Canada because of natural disasters like what happened in November with the mudslides and the rain. It wasn't that the Port of Vancouver was affected, it was that the rail tracks and the roads and the entry points in the Port of Vancouver that allow goods to be moved in and out of the Port of Vancouver were cut off. Fortunately, it took time, but it took about 2 months before the Port of Vancouver was actually back up and running at full, what they were calling full operating capabilities. But even then, before that, the port was already congested. So understand where your goods enter or exit Canada, how much of your goods are actually going through one particular point, and what are your backup options. Now, if you look at land crossings, okay, very interestingly, look at land crossings, Ambassador Bridge, Peace Bridge, two most busiest land crossings for entry of goods and exit goods in and out of Canada. And they're both in Ontario, both in Ontario. So you do not want natural disasters affecting Ontario, blizzards, winter storm, that basically impede the flow of goods crossing the border. Nor do you want events such as man-made events such like Freedom Convoy shutting down the bridge for 6 days, in this case, Ambassador Bridge for 6 days, impeding the flow of goods into and out of Canada, leading the US government to actually plead for the Canadian government to actually resolve the situation. Now, if you think about goods flying into Canada, okay, flying to Canada, here's an interesting factoid. There are 13 international Canadas in there are 13 international airports in Canada that can handle air cargo. When you compare that to the United States, okay, there are approximately 50. So there are fewer entry points for goods flying into Canada, of which 50% of them go through Pearson International and Hamilton, both of which are in Ontario. So you have land crossing concentrated in Ontario. You got air cargo concentrated in Ontario. Help us all if something were to make Ontario not accessible. So understanding where your goods flow in and out, and understanding what your backup options are, understanding how much is actually flowing in and out through those points is an important consideration when you talk about magnifying visibility into your supply chains. But there are other questions that you can ask once you understand what we mean by magnifying visibility. Who really manufactures your goods? This is what I mean by, do you only see your first-tier suppliers? Do you also know who their suppliers are? Do you interact with them? How far up do you interact with your suppliers upstream? How far downstream do you interact with your intermediate, entities that actually get your goods to the customers? Where are the handoffs? The more handoffs you have, the greater the cost, the greater the likelihood of damage, breaches, security issues, and so forth. Who actually is responsible for the handoff? You, a third party or fourth party logistics provider? These are questions that you should be asking if you really want to manage your supply chains effectively. Again, it is because you cannot manage well what you do not see. Tip number 3, prioritize your purchases because you need to prioritize associated actions. This is a classic understanding of how you can classify your purchases, what you source, into 4 different buckets. Okay, strategic goods by definition are very important, and there are 2 reasons why they're important. One is because they're high risk of supply not being available, and they have tremendous impact on whether or not you make money, right? So strategic goods have high profit impact and high supply risk. When you compare that to the goods that are called non-critical, well, those are goods that you can easily find available. Those are goods that, have very little impact on whether or not you make money. Now, the reason why you need to understand and prioritize what you buy into these buckets is because you don't really have the time to focus or control everything. But you must make time for the most important of everything. And by the most important, I mean strategic goods. So some of the associate actions that come from prioritizing your purchases include: when do you own and where do you hold inventory of these strategic goods. So here's a very simple matrix where we talk about, on one axis, who legally owns the goods? Do you own it? Does your supplier own it? Where do you actually hold those goods? Is it stored inside your facility or is it stored inside your supplier's facility? For strategic goods, let's not even consider what we call inventory postponement. Inventory postponement is an option where basically you wait until you know what the demand is, the timing, and the quantity that's demanded before you go and purchase, source, and bring the goods to the customer. Instead, consider the following remaining three options. If there are no financial or physical storage constraints, then go ahead and pursue what's called inventory speculation. Stock up, okay? Because you don't have financial constraints and to pay for legal ownership of the goods up front, nor do you have concerns about where you're going to store the goods because they're strategic. You know that eventually you'll need to use them and they will be consumed. If on the other hand, you do have financial constraints, you didn't get that line of credit, you didn't get that loan, then consider working with your supplier where basically you ask for what's called forward consignment. Ask the supplier to let you hold the inventory and you would pay the supplier once you've actually used this. Conversely, if you do not have any financial constraints, you can actually pay for the goods, right? No problem with money, but there's no space, then ask for what's called reverse consignment, where essentially your supplier holds on to that inventory on your behalf, but you own it. Now, think about these two options we refer to as forward consignment and reverse consignment. These options work if and only if you and your supplier not only have a contractual, ironclad contractual obligation, but there's a high degree of trust that both sides are going to honor the contractual obligations and both sides are actually going to behave in such a manner that will raise both parties' profitability, business profitability. So if you look at why we need to prioritize purchases into these buckets, it's because there are consequent actions and decisions that have to be made tied to the class of goods that they belong to. Of course, if they are non-critical goods, then inventory postponement makes a lot of sense. You don't have to stockpile, okay? Just place an order for what you need, okay, when you actually know when the demand occurs and how much is actually asked of it. Other associated actions that are tied to understanding where these purchases fall into include what sort of relationship do you want to have with your suppliers? For strategic goods, clearly that relationship cannot be transactional. It has to be more strategic in nature, based on trust that allow you to maybe integrate your information, the processes better, that will determine whether or not you use third-party, fourth-party logistics providers to actually manage the flow of goods for you. And last but not least, how you allocate order quantities inside versus overseas. And I'll get to this point again later in this section. But understanding what bucket your purchases fall into have other questions that you should be able to answer based on that classification. Tip number 4, diversify to reduce supply management risk. So we already talked about supply chains today being global with limited visibility, but supply chains today also are producing very complex products using contract manufacturers for major subsystems. And what's happened is that instead of a lot of small suppliers working on different parts of your product, we now have fewer suppliers due to supply-based rationalizing working on major subsystems. And so what's changed is the number of critical nodes in your supply chain. Where we used to have a lot, now we have fewer. And the fewer the critical nodes you have, the changes to the power dynamics will also occur. When you have fewer critical nodes, the power that you exert over supplier changes. And so you actually have reduced power over your suppliers. And some of that power now shifts over to the fewer critical nodes. They know that, you know that, you need to understand why you actually reduce the number of suppliers. Yes, it does reduce monitoring, coordination costs, but at the same time, you also understand that it shifts the power. It also increases the vulnerability of the supply chains to critical nodes that actually go down, right? So in the second picture that you see here, if one of these two nodes go down, your supply chain is disrupted. On the left-hand side, if your smaller node goes down, maybe you can have inventory of the whatever part that's being made by this location in Africa at a lower cost. And so your supply chain would be less likely to be disrupted. So this is what we mean by diversifying to reduce supply chain risk, because you do not really want to put all your eggs in one basket. Now, of course, you may have no choice but to actually put all your eggs in one basket, in which case, then let's go to Andrew Carnegie, who basically said, if you have no choice and you have to put all your eggs in one basket, then you must then watch that basket very closely. So one implication of this tip as relates to sourcing is the following. Suppose you are in Ontario and everything that you buy comes from China. The two largest trading partners for Canada, number one is the US, number two is China. But if you look at what is being traded with China and the US, a lot of what we import from the US, from Canada, are what I call generally what I call B2B goods, okay? Machinery, truck parts, and so forth. A lot of what we import from Canada, from China, are what I call B2C goods that actually are sold directly to consumers. So if you as a business buy everything that you need from one country, okay, tip number 4 say that is not a good strategy and you need to diversify. So avoid, if possible, buying everything from one location, because all it takes is for political instability, the country to shut down, for you to be sort of holding your hands and worrying about the situation. So avoid the situation. Now, it also means minimizing what we call single sourcing, buying from one supplier. And instead, what I advocate and what I've seen companies do is establish what's called near-far options with proper risk-based allocation. So instead of 100% of your orders going to one supplier far away, perhaps split the order quantity into a large portion where you leverage volume-based pricing far away, and then a smaller portion that actually is located with a supplier, assuming equal capability, closer to you, in this case, in Canada. So the near-far option to avoid putting all your eggs in one basket is really to think about dual sourcing, where you have two suppliers equally capable, one far away, one nearby, where the far away supplier actually has lower cost, and the nearer supplier maybe has higher cost, but it safeguards against things not flowing from, in this case, China, through your port of entry, Vancouver, to you. Because then at least you still can continue to work, maybe not at the same rate, but you won't shut down. If you have no choice but to single source from far away, then someone who works for you needs to actually be there to keep an eye out. This is what Andrew Carnegie was saying when you say, watch that basket. You can watch from afar when there's 24 hours time difference, physical distance. You cannot watch from, so you need to actually have somebody over there who works for you, situated in that facility, if possible, okay, who will watch out for how things are going on your behalf and alert you to what may be going wrong or what may be going wrong, so you get your information faster. The last tip is about investing in what we call adapt capabilities. Adapt is sort of a word that we made up, right, to refer to 6 different specific capabilities. I discussed this in a paper that is actually forthcoming, likely winter 2022 issue of Sloan Management Review. As with the video, feel free to reach out to me. And when the digital print version of the paper is available, I'm going to be happy to share that with you. Let me very briefly explain what these capabilities are. Anticipate is the capability to actually remember what triggered your supply disruptions in the past, and importantly, be able to imagine, foresee, visualize what we call unknown but knowable triggers, and figure out that if those events were to occur, they could interrupt your flow. Suppose you locate your facility in a location not close to water, but somehow you have someone who says, okay, let's assume, even though we're not close to the coast, we're not close to the river, let's suppose that rain falls continues for 30 days and therefore we get flooded. Therefore, our plant actually will shut down. What are we going to do? That's what we mean by anticipation capability. Do you have the ability to actually think about things that haven't happened, but if they were to happen, would shut you down? Do you have the ability to remember things that have occurred and actually understand why they occur and how you were shut down because of when they occurred in the past? Okay. So I often ask companies and say, well, who inside your company actually has a very cushy, quote unquote cushy, facetiously, easy job of doing nothing other than read the news, scan the internet, talk to people to find out what could be happening nearby, far away, and actually think about, well, if that were to happen to your business, what's going to happen? Who has that job? Most organizations I talk to said, we don't have someone like that. And so investing in anticipation capability means that consciously think about investing in a team, in a person, capability that actually allows you to actually get that kind of information. And the analogy I often point to is when you think about spy agencies, right? So in the US, we have the CIA, in Canada, we have CSIS. What do? They do exactly this. They just watch things around the world, read up on what's going on, trying to figure out if this were to occur, how does that affect Canada? How does that affect the US? Companies need that capability as well, which we refer to as anticipation capability. Do you have the ability to actually know, and ideally at this exact moment, when your supply is being interrupted, or when an event occurs that will in fact interrupt the physical flow of goods to you or from you to the market? Do you have that capability? A lot of these capabilities today are being invested in AI, machine learning, Internet of Things. Because why? These are capabilities that actually allow you to get the information. But getting the information by itself isn't going to actually warn you. You still have to analyze it to make sure that it is indeed indicating that flow may be deviating from what is expected. Detection capability. What about diagnostic? And that's what I mean by analysis. Do you really understand what's happening? Can you understand what has happened in the past? Who within your organization has the responsibility of saying, okay, here's what we have learned. Here's what we need to codify. And here's everything that we know about why what happened to us occurred. Diagnostic capability. Diagnostic is actually a very important capability because you cannot solve a problem unless you know exactly what's going on. It's similar to tip number 2 when I say magnify visibility into your supply chain. You cannot manage what you cannot see. You cannot have a good solution for what you do not understand. Activate. Are you able to marshal resources quickly, effectively, to actually respond? In other words, do you have a command center for when things go wrong? Who is in charge when things go wrong? Do you have to wait for the CEO? Do you wait for the top manager to actually issue orders? Or is your organization ready to spring into action when things are going wrong? And if you do not have capability, then invest in something like that. A retailer I used to work for actually said, yep, at corporate headquarters, we actually have a designated command center room. And when a crisis occurs, people know exactly who's supposed to be in that room, who's going to actually issue orders, and who's going to actually take control from the CEO to deal with that problem. Because any moment wasted trying to figure out who's supposed to do what is a moment that will make the consequences of any interruption in physical flow more severe for you. So activation is a capability that also must be invested in. Can you protect your supply chains from being disrupted in the future? Have you learned from the past? What are you doing to redesign your supply chain so that it does not, become susceptible to the same event that has occurred in the past? Okay. If you locate your facility in a flood zone, okay, how do you protect it? Well, you can either relocate away from the flood zone, or you make sure that you build the structure in such a way that if it does flood, you won't be as affected. This is what we mean by protect capability. And last but not least, you have to track. What information are you tracking? Are you able to monitor the right information and actually update the information, elevate that information to the right decision makers in order for you to make sure that your supply chains are actually humming along as expected? So as you think about these 5 capabilities, this is why I said, this is not the job of somebody who's working on the front line. This is top management responsibility to actually build these capabilities so that you are then able to meet the objective, meet the goal, right 6, and ensure that your supply chain has a chance of coming along and being effective. So in the last few minutes of our time here, in the last few minutes on that, let me just talk about what the key takeaways are. And of course, I can go on forever, but we have so much time. The first point I want you to take away is that you're managing networks, not a chain. And these networks will change over time. So don't be fooled into thinking that today I know exactly what my supply chain looks like. Well, tomorrow it can change very quickly if new regulations are passed. Okay? If a new supplier comes in the picture that's better than your current supplier, if new materials are actually made available that actually they improve the quality of the products that you're sourcing. So supply chains are living organisms that change because of decisions that are taken. 2, don't be fooled into thinking that you can avoid being disrupted. Instead, manage for the eventuality of being disrupted. Make decisions realizing that sooner or later you will be disrupted. It's a matter of when, not a matter of if. And with that perspective, then you can hopefully be able to minimize frequency of being disrupted and recover quickly when disrupted. The 5 tips I share with you today hopefully will spur other tips that you can think through, for your organization. Write 6 as a North Star to gauge your decisions. Really magnify visibility in your supply chains, understanding that that's an ongoing effort. Right? It's not a one-time, situation that today I draw my supply chain and we know exactly what's going on because of point number 1. Visibility is also a matter of time and investment. How far up the supply chain you go depends on how much effort you put in. How far down the supply chain you go depends on how much effort you put in terms of personnel resources, time, infrastructure, information technologies, and so forth. Prioritize your purchases. Understand what is it that you buy. Understand that you cannot manage everything in the same way. Figure out what's strategic and make sure that those strategic goods are actually managed with strategic actions, as opposed to non-critical items that require a different set of actions. Diversify so that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. I gave you an implication as relates to sourcing. You can extend that implication to every decision that you make where you do not box yourself into just one option. And if you do have to pick just one option and there's no other options available, then make sure that you actually watch and monitor that situation closely. Somebody must be given this responsibility to watch over that single option that you have. And last but not least, think about these adapt capabilities. They are investments that have to be made, but these investments pay back because if these investments minimize your disruptions in the supply chain, that means that you are allowing your supply chains to hum along and be effective in meeting right 6 and deliver goods to the right customer at the right time, in the right place, in the right quantity, with the right quality at the right cost. So with that, I'm going to open up myself to questions that you have. For those of you who wish to reach out and ask me for the digital print of this loan management review paper or that IBM commercial that is so powerful in terms of making the message without actually stating the message, please note my contact information as shown here. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Johnny. So much great information there. Almost overwhelming at times when we start to look at certainly the complexities of supply chain is incredible. Question that popped into my head as you were talking was this concept that a lot of global economists are mentioning now, and with the geopolitical state around the world right now, of the whole concept of deglobalization. We're such a global economy at one time, and now there's this discussion of deglobalization or reduced global reliance, I guess, on the global supply chain. How do you see that heading as it relates to overall supply chain issues?
It's a great question because I hear that all the time. Let's do more, production and manufacturing inside the boundaries of our country, right? In principle, it's a good idea because it has spillover effects, like more jobs for Canadians, more economic growth for the country. But in reality, impossible, right? As long as we buy and sell in the global economy, global sourcing is something that cannot be avoided unless you are willing, as Canadians or as any citizen of any country, to pay the higher prices for having things being made inside the country. Now,
Right.
That's one reason. The other reason is that it's impossible for any country to make everything. Right? In economics, talk about the principle of comparative advantage. Right? So, yes, does it make sense to wave the banner of reshoring, which is how this all started? Yes, it's a good soundbite, but we have to reshore properly. Right? Not everything can be brought back, should be brought back, and that's why I talked about the near-far option. Right? It's okay to actually manufacture a small portion in the country if we understand what it does to our cost. It may not allow us to sell at the lowest price, buy at the lowest price, but at least it buffers against my goods not being shipped out of the country, it getting stuck or sinking on its way, as it makes its way across the ocean, right? So that's the reason why we have this near-far option. And that may be better than just saying, let's shut our borders and just be self-sufficient. As I said, not possible.
Do you see a time in the future, though, where that may become inevitable? Like where the not that I'm an expert on it or anything, but they talk a lot about how the aging population in China is going to ultimately affect manufacturing, and our reliance on China for raw materials, resources, and even finished goods, like you said, for the B2C market is pretty heavy. Is there a point in time where you see that it may be inevitable that some more shrinking or even vertical integration that companies may need to get into in order to protect their supply chains?
Vertical integration means that, okay, you actually own any facility that is actually upstream, right? But as long as, and I use China as an example, as long as your company is not Chinese, vertical integration only protects so much, right? Because the country can still implement stringent regulations that prevent you in China shipping goods in and out, right? So we talked about China and the shift away from China as the global manufacturer role. Well, the Chinese are aware of that, and that's why they're making huge investments into Africa, in Vietnam, right? So as we look at the history of economic development, we see rises and declines, right? At one point, the US was the largest manufacturer. Well, that shifted now to China. So the question is, what's the next country or continent? Now, we're all betting on Africa and Latin America, right? So as Canadian businesses, if we are aware of this and we're not making strategic moves to act from the federal government level as well as from the private to actually also be in those regions, then we may be behind the 8 ball as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So many concepts. The one that you brought up that kind of blew me away, and intuitively should have known it, I guess, but just the reliance that we have on Vancouver as a port around North America, third largest port, I think that you said, by sea, but yet the second least effective or at least
Right.
practical. That's fascinating. So that whole concept of taking a look at your supply chain and where goods are coming in to your organization, or even where you're shipping out of, is so crucial. At what time do you think a business needs to invest in an expert within their organization on supply chain to help them? But is there a tipping point that you see in terms of revenues, or maybe the value of the cost of goods that you're bringing in, where you need to start looking at kind of bringing in an expert to help you manage this?
Well, if everybody inside an organization understands the supply chain, understand flows of goods and services, it's less critical, right? It's only when we treat, the supply chain as its transactional activity, we buy stuff, as opposed to we have to understand the flow of goods coming into us, that we then need to maybe centralize, designate a person, appoint a person. There's actually research that shows that if you have a person with a supply chain management title sitting on the board, you're likely to be more effective.
Oh,
right?
okay.
So we've seen some of the more advanced companies that understand the importance of supply management elevate people into board positions so that they can actually provide that perspective, right?
Cool.
to ensure that decisions are being taken, being made with a true understanding of how this does affect the supply chain that we are managing. Because as we now talked about today, it's not your company competing against your competitor for a chunk of the market, is your supply chain competing against your competitor's supply chain for share of the market. So it's no longer just a one-to-one entity, it's like chain to chain, or better yet, network to network, competition that's going on.
Yeah, right.
This is where I could have added, you're only as strong as your supply chain is a tip, right? To actually really sensitize, and understanding that as you think about your business, think about how strong you are, and that your weakest point is really the weakest player in that supply chain.
Yeah, very cool. And I guess, in considering, so it's wonderful when you're a large organization and you have the flexibility or the ability to have a board of directors. When you're a smaller business, as you started to grow your supply chain and grow your business revenues, you kind of need to look at the ROI trade-off, I guess. What's the impact of a disruption of your supply chain on your overall revenues versus hiring somebody that's an expert to help you manage it more effectively? So you really, I guess there's not a magic tipping point, rather it's got to be an ROI discussion that the owner of the business themselves have, right?
And Mike, you make a very good point. And one of my eggs, when I was asked, given the opportunity to actually talk today, was my worry that that we are looking for silver bullets or specific solution. Right. And the reality is that I could be a snake oil salesman and tell you this is a specific solution, but then it will not be the right solution for everybody. Which is why I wanted to talk about, here's the way you want to think about the situation. Okay, here's the tips that allow you to ask better questions, because the specific solution depends on what kind of product you're making, how big you are, how much power you have in your supply network. Okay, and so without that contextual understanding, it's very hard for anybody to say, consider this very specific solution. The two very specific solutions I can really give you is really one is that near far option that I talked about, right? The other is something that I alluded to, which is that as you think about working with your customers and suppliers, right? The one important ingredient is trust, okay? Trust is an enabler for adherence to contract terms. Trust is also a mechanism that allow, all parties to actually want to work together. So when we talk about the British Columbia flooding, it took 2 months to actually sort of get things back to normal. But it was but how quickly the British government declared an emergency, got all the stakeholders together, the rail companies, the Port of Vancouver, to actually talk about how do we get things back to normal quickly. If there was not some modicum of trust to actually work together, then this could have taken much longer, right? So trust, as you think about your business, it's not just meeting a contract terms. Think about how you are building that trust in your relationship with your supplier, whether it's a strategic supplier or transactional supplier. Because if they trust you, then they will be flexible with you. They're willing to be flexible, extend better terms or longer terms. But if they don't trust you, then it's like, here's a contract, right? We're going to go to court, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
trust, trust actually, in some ways, it's like a family, right? If your family has a lot of trust, then you have a better functioning set of engagements inside, with your wife, with your children. So.
It's so different when you say that, really, then you're building trust with your customers and with your clients that you're selling to. You have to have that equal amount of trust with your supply chain as you do with your customers, so that you can work together. And as you said something too, I thought larger businesses can certainly help squeeze out smaller competitors as they take control of the supply chain. So if they can contractually obligate certain suppliers to them specifically, or more to them, then it can become a competitive tool as well, I guess, as you grow your business.
Yeah, and this is unfortunately a practice that occurs often when you have a very powerful business that can mandate, right? And a business that does that blindly actually ends up creating problems for themselves, because if they mandate your supplier to cut costs without truly understanding why the costs are so high, you could basically force that supplier out of business, and you end up either having to find a supplier, or you end up having to now insource what they were doing for you. And that may not be the best situation. So these mandates are good to prod activities or prod action, but they should not be taken lightly. They should be taken with full understanding of what's happening with your supplier. And this is where, if you think about how the Japanese work with the suppliers, Japanese car manufacturers, they don't come just as an assembly plant. They also ask the suppliers to come along with them. Why? Because now you have the near far option, being manifested. But those suppliers, they know. Oftentimes the supplier could have been a former employee who then went off to start their own business. Why? Because they know the capability of the supplier. They understand whether or not asking them for a 50% cut facetiously, right, is feasible, right? Because if it's not feasible, that supplier goes under. You lose a capable supplier, you have to find this. That's all cost you, right? So it's important, as we think about managing supply chain, and this is why the trust issue is, that you have visibility, understanding, and you build enough trust so that what you ask is not asked because of ignorance. It's asked because you know it's feasible.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Love it, John. I could carry on this conversation for a long time. Lots of questions brewing, but at the same time, and knowing your time constraints, or not your time constraints, but the time that we have here together, I think we'll bring things to a close. But truly, on behalf of Tech Canada, all of our viewers and all of our members, as they review these videos afterwards and review these webinars within their groups, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Appreciate the opportunity to learn a little bit more from you, and look forward to hearing from you again.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity, and have a wonderful day, rest of the day, and looking forward to other possibilities to engage.
Our sincere pleasure. Thanks, Johnny. Take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye now.